In September 2000, work was being carried out at the old toll booth in Stirling to change it into an art centre. During construction work, a skeleton in a pine coffin was discovered, and it turned out it was the remains of Allan Mair, the last man to be hanged in Stirling on 4th October 1843. He was an 84-year-old farmer from Candy End, Muirhaven side, married to Mary Fletcher, 85, and the couple had a daughter, Agnes, from whom he was estranged. He'd been convicted of murdering his wife by hitting her repeatedly over the head with his walking stick on the night of 14th-15th May 1843. She'd been abused by him for years. She'd been starved, as well as being placed in a box for long periods of time. At his trial, Mair declared his innocence. Helen Benny, or Nimmo, testified that she knew the Mairs. Benny, along with others, visited Mary once or twice a day. Around New Year, when she'd gone round, Mary had complained of having a sore back, and she noticed she wasn't walking very well. Mary confided that she'd not had any food from Mair as she ought to, in his presence. He shouted at her and wished her in hell with her soul burning. Mair had a habit of keeping the provisions locked up, so Mary couldn't get them. It was claimed he starved her, but her neighbours provided her with what food they could spare, but this was always done when he was out. Countless times, Mair was witnessed abusing her. Benny last saw her on 14th May, around 7 o'clock, and had given her some supper. Soon afterwards, she became aware of the sound of blows raining down and Mary crying out. The blows sounded like hammer blows. She heard Mary say to Mair to stop hitting her and to let her die in peace. The next morning, having been too afraid to knock at the door, Benny went round with some tea. It was then she saw Mary in the bed, bruised, blood covering her shirt, and her arms bare. There was a lot of blood on the bed itself. She offered her the tea, while Mair went to the minister's house, and she sat with her. Mary told her Mair had beaten her. Benny sent for a police officer, and Mair was duly arrested. Shortly afterwards, Mary died. Before his death, he was held in the condemned cell, with his legs shackled to a chain rooted in the flagstone floor, and for 4 or 5 days he refused food following his conviction. He gave up on his protest, however, and started eating again. He appealed to the Secretary of State for Scotland, but it fell on deaf ears, with the Secretary stating the law must take its course. The conviction stood. The night before his execution, he heard the scaffold being erected outside and said what a horrible thing to be hanged like a dog. On waking at 5 a.m, one of his keepers read the Bible to him, and they spoke about it afterwards. Mair told the Reverend Mr. Stark that he was going to address the crowd and tell them how unjustly he'd been treated. At 8 o'clock, the provost and magistrates entered the court hall, and Mair was brought in soon afterwards, accompanied by 2 officers, as well as the clergyman who'd seen to his spiritual guidance. These were the Reverend Mr. Stark, the jail's chaplain, and ministers Gilfillan, Leach, Watson and Harper. He was bent almost double and was weeping bitterly. He sat down opposite them, and a short passage was read from the Bible, while he rocked himself back and forth. During all of this, he kept wringing his hands. Once this was complete, he was offered a glass of wine, which he refused, stating he wouldn't go into the hands of God drunk. The executioner, dressed in a light jacket and trousers seamed in black and red, with a large black mask covering his face, entered, then tied Mair's arms behind him. He complained the ties were too tight. He was brought to the scaffold in Broad Street, but he was weak, so a chair was brought to him. He shouted at the crowd he was innocent, that he'd been unjustly condemned through false swearing. Mair cursed those who'd convicted him, shouting at them, "I curse the witnesses with all the curses of the 100th Psalm." He paused after a few minutes for breath, so the executioner stepped forward and asked him if he was ready. "No, sir, I am not done," he replied. He turned to the crowd once more and stated, "I have been unjustly accused, falsely sworn against, and unlawfully condemned." He went on for another 5 minutes before he was stopped, as the crowd was becoming impatient. The hood was placed over his head, and the hangman adjusted the rope around his neck. He was forced out of his chair, and while he was still muttering, was hanged at 8:43 that morning. Before he finally died, one of his hands managed to get free, and he tried to release himself from being hanged. Afterwards, his body was placed in the coffin, and he was taken to a cell before being buried in the passage leading to the courtyard, where he lay undisturbed until its discovery by workmen over 150 years later. Customers at the old toll booth have said that a waitress told them the place was haunted by an old man, but only on a Wednesday. The day Mair was hanged, 4th October, was a Wednesday. The area she had pointed to was where the skeleton had been discovered, but she hadn't known the story until then. When the building was used as a tourist information centre, the woman who worked there in the early 1990s complained that she felt she was being watched. She was told that apparently that only occurred when new staff began working there. As a theatre, the apparition of an old man used to appear. Once the arts centre opened and the story became known, unusual activity was reported, such as wine glasses flying off tables, and upstairs, where the old cells had been, an employee heard what he thought sounded like a body being dragged across the floor. In 2003, a parapsychology team were called in, and they found the presence of an old man and 4 others. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.